bode well for their general economic IQ. So anyway, many eons ago, I was at my college roommate's wedding, and I was talking with the groom's father, who I had not seen in several years, and the conversation, of course, eventually turned to what I was doing with my then relatively young career. And he was not familiar with the nonprofit policy group where I worked, and so I failed to have that 10-second elevator speech that described the work of my organization, so I reverted to traditional DC speak. And I said, "It's a think tank." And I fully expected his eyes to open with profound clarity and his head to nod with a certain understanding, because everybody knows what a think tank is. After a 2-second pause, he reared his head back and laughed uproariously. And for the next 48 hours, even while we stood at the front of the church during the ceremony, he would glance at me, shake his head, mumble a think tank, and laugh and laugh. This was the first realization in my career that I would never really be understood by those outside the Beltway, and I would be doomed to conversations repeated ad nauseum with family members that led with, "So what do you do again?" We here represent 4 think tanks that we believe are part of the nucleus of an intellectual movement devoted to defending and promoting the principles espoused by our founding fathers and the many who came before them. We are, of course, not the only 4, and that is a very good thing. But we represent a necessary element of today's political realities. There are approximately 500 politically diverse think tanks in Washington, D.C. alone, and thousands more spread around America, and indeed increasingly around the globe. And they are varied in mission and with their audience, from broad university-based groups studying the big picture to grassroots thinkers with specific model legislation. I suspect a phrase that Ed, Arthur, John, and I have uttered is, "Ideas matter and ideas have consequences." We have said it to motivate faithful conservatives and libertarians who care deeply about the direction of this country, or perhaps the lack thereof. We say it to remind our elected officials that we are a country founded on principles of free enterprise and limited public institutions, and their role is to espouse those principles, not to enjoy the unearned largesse that comes with the unfortunate growth of corporatism, cronyism, and collectivism. Think tanks devoted to understanding and promoting economic and individual freedom should not be a laughing matter. Instead, they have enabled this liberty movement to grow throughout the decades. Keep in mind that as many of you stand in the political trenches of primaries and propositions and general elections, so have each of our respective institutions fought with ideas-based advocacy groups. And there are many who oppose us. In the mid-70s and early 80s, it was conservatives and libertarians who were most creative in adding intellectual muscle to political opportunity and countering the growing number of statist policy centers which frankly benefited from the status quo. The Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and the Competitive Enterprise Institute grew out of that great period of policy entrepreneurship, bolstering the efforts of the American Enterprise Institute, which for decades before had been pushing back against many attempts to stymie free enterprise. Of course, the left recognized this intellectual threat and invested heavily in establishing its own ideas brokers, since, as we all know, they have had and still have much to lose if we indeed get a more limited government with fewer dependent citizens, if that comes to pass. So we have to ask ourselves, is it enough? Is there hope? After political failure, it is commonplace that many in our movement simply blame the actual candidates or consultants or the media instead of coming to terms with what may be a sobering lesson of 2012. In the midst of one of the worst economic periods of recent U.S. history, Barack Obama and his allies argued that Washington, D.C. is a better steward of American life and liberty than Americans themselves. And that argument prevailed. Ideas still matter, but bad ideas have devastating consequences. In the next few minutes, I hope we can address the importance of ideas within the halls of political power and gamesmanship. Ed on the historical and future importance of ideas to our movement, Arthur on how we can communicate these ideas more effectively, and John on how the think tank model can be used, for example, to attack the anti-capitalism message coming out of our universities. When Gulliver visits the Grand Academy of Legato, he laughs at their schemes to improve society. But he leaves melancholy unsure if political leaders are capable of putting moral truth or scientific knowledge into practice. The four of us believe they can and have devoted our careers to the theory and practice of how to link knowledge and power, especially on behalf of liberty and prosperity. So let's talk about that. And Ed Feulner, why don't you lead us off?
Thanks very much, Lawson. I want everybody here to know that the four of us have one immediate fundamental agreement, and that was that we were going to join together as a consortium and hire Ben Carson to come to work for all four of us. Man, that guy is terrific. What a great set of insights. I'll bet just about everybody here was involved in one way or another in a certain election that was held last November. And the first thing I want to remind all of you is that there are basically two kinds of politics in the United States. There is what we all worked and were involved in last November, electoral politics. Then there is what we now have, policy politics. What happens after the gals and guys are elected and sworn in, and how do we get to what Lawson was talking about in terms of making our ideas have those right kind of consequences. All of us up here believe in a certain set of principles: free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional values. It brings us all together. And how do we do it? We do it with what I call the 3 I's. First, we've got the right ideas. Ideas like freedom, like ordered liberty, like letting an individual rise as high as she or he can up the ladder of opportunity. Second, we've got the individuals, whether they're particular scholars at our own institutions, or whether they're the ones on whose shoulders we all stand. The Milton Friedmans, the Friedrich Hayeks, and all the others, or going back to the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, to the Adam Smiths. And the third, where we on the conservative side and the libertarian side are so much better off today than we were back, say, 25 or 30 years ago, the institutions. There are strong, vibrant, energetic institutions on the right today, and we do come together. Yes, there are ways that we can work together. You heard me say the other night that one of our objectives coming out of CPAC has to be to add and multiply, not to divide and subtract, and find those issues that bring us together. Let's go to war, but let's go to war with the common enemy, the liberal progressive notion that somehow government's going to be the solution to where they think we should be going. Institutionally, we all do it a little bit differently. Our structures are different, our support base is different, but I'll tell you something else that the four of us up here agree on. Unlike a lot of center-left think tanks up here, we don't take any government grants. If you support any of us, it's basically because you agree with our ideas. It's not because, in effect, with the force of a gun, somebody's taking money away from you and giving it to us. That's not the way we work in our version of a free society. Yes, we're different. I take great pride in the fact that at Heritage we have more than 600,000 members around the country. I look back when I first came to Heritage that there weren't 600,000 people in the country who knew what a think tank was. I never quite had the experience with the father of the groom snickering at the notion of a think tank throughout a wedding at me. But we have had some kind of puzzled looks over the year when I've been sitting in the 17th row of an airplane to Chicago in the middle seat. And as Steve Forbes is wont to say, if you ever want to clear the seats out on either side, start talking to them about new monetary policy. Same thing, talk to them about what life is like at a think tank. But today, these ideas matter, and they're having a major and real impact. To listen to Ben Carson is to listen to a smart man, but to listen to Ben Carson is not to necessarily have to care about how much he knows, because we know how much he cares. And that's a part of what we have to be able to bring over, that it isn't how much we know, it's that they know how much we care. And as Arthur talks about communicating, that's going to be one of the premises as we go ahead and try to move ahead. One of the big challenges we face, and we have faced in the think tank business, I don't know if we're going to have a chance to talk about it up here, but I know from talking to each of my colleagues on different occasions, it's something that challenges all of us. We measure inputs. How many people work for us? What's the size of our budget? All that. Then you go through a stage and you measure outputs. How many conferences did you have? How many papers did you produce? How many times were your gals and guys on TV? What we have to get to, not only in the think tank business, but throughout the whole business of policy politics, is how do we measure outcomes? Not just inputs, not just outputs, but outcomes. We got to get better at doing that. We got to get better at staying focused, and that's why in past years I've been so proud to work with my colleagues. Ed Crane, former head of Cato, back when George W. Bush, 2005, was talking about alternatives to Social Security. Crane and I got on a couple of airplanes and we went to New York, and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post, and out to Chicago to the Tribune and the Sun-Times and even to the Washington Post, to talk to them about, hey, there are things we disagree about at our two institutions, but this is a way to advance individual freedom and individual choice, and we're together on this. So when we all have the opportunity to work together, I think it's up to us to look for those opportunities and try to find as many of them as we can. My last thought is Washington's congenital conservative optimist. We've got to learn how to communicate as much more effectively than we have. My successor, Jim DeMint, who was here Thursday night for the keynote speech, has likened it to the fact that as conservatives, we got to go out and sell vegetables and tell people what some of the challenges are that they're facing. In the meantime, the other guys on the liberal progressive side are giving away free candy. Well, if we're selling vegetables and they're giving away candy, guess who's going to win? So we've got to be able to go back to those first principles in the Constitution. We've got to be able to talk fundamentally about what we agree on and what's best, not just for us up here, but what's best for all the American people in terms of opening up that ladder of opportunity and making sure we're all able to climb up it. So thanks everybody for being here. Ideas matter, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Ed. Arthur, why don't you come up and give us your thoughts?
Thanks, Lawson. It's an honor to be with all of you here today. Ed's last thought was about congenital conservative optimism, which sounds like a pretty bad disease. But I do want to start on the topic of optimism. I'm married to an immigrant, and many of you know that immigrants are, in the United States at least, are extremely optimistic by nature. And to give you an idea of how optimistic my wife is, an optimistic conservative, congenital or otherwise, a few months ago we were having a pretty bad parent-teacher conference, and some of you have had this experience too. And afterward, you know, it was a grades issue, and we were on our way. I can tell this story because my son is here today. Afterward, we were in the car coming home, And we were kind of silent. It was sort of this icy silence. And my wife finally says, let's look at it this way. At least we know he's not cheating. But the day after the election in November 7th, my wife got up and she said, I just don't know if our country's going to be all right. And that was the first time I'd ever heard her say anything like that. Now, I know some of you felt that way too. So what do we need to do in the idea world? What do we need to do in this industry where we're trying to marshal the ideas that we can run to the patriots like you to turn this thing around? And the first thing that we need to do is to ask what's going on. Now, what's going on is encapsulated in one statistic, sort of the only statistic you need to know about November 6th, and it's this. The question that came out from every reputable pollster, who do you think cares more about people like you? I know you've heard it. I know it makes you sick to your stomach, but I'm going to remind you. Only 1/3 of Americans in every reputable poll said they thought Republicans cared about people like them. Only 38% of Americans said they thought that Republicans cared about the poor. Now, before you dismiss this, and I know you want to dismiss it, and so do I, and we have data to show that that's not right, but before you dismiss it, think for a second about what people have been going through over the past 5 years. People in the bottom half of the income distribution, patriotic Americans all over this country who've been struggling. We hear day after day that the unemployment rate is 7.7%. That's nonsense. The real unemployment rate is 15%. It's been 15% for 40 months. Income has been falling. Real household incomes have been falling for the average Americans, especially in the bottom half, every year for 5 years. Imagine, this is exhausting when you get worse off every single year. And here's the worst statistic of all. Mobility is falling. It's been falling for a long time. It's fallen by 1/3 since 1980, the ability to move from the bottom 20% to the middle class or above. Some studies today show that mobility is higher in France than it is in the United States. Something's wrong, and we got to have an answer. And too many people think that conservatives don't have an answer for them. What did they hear in the last election campaign? What did they hear from President Obama? They had this. They said, President Obama said, the rich people have your stuff, and I'm going to get it back. Now, it's nonsense. Americans don't like it, really, but what was the alternative? The 47% comment? The idea that the bottom half are just a bunch of moochers? They don't like that either, and I understand that. We have to do better. Now, here's the irony of all of this. The irony that drives us all crazy. The truth of the matter is, if you want to help poor people, we have the ideas that are going to get that done. Look around the world. Since 1970, the world's worst poverty, the percentage of the world's population living on $1 a day or less, has declined by 80%. 80%. The greatest anti-poverty achievement in the history of the world has occurred since 1970. Was it because of the wonderful United Nations? Was it the World Bank or the IMF or global socialism or U.S. foreign aid? Of course not. It was 5 things: globalization, free trade, property rights, rule of law, and American-style entrepreneurship. To coin a phrase, you built that. You and your values and your American free enterprise system have pulled more billions of people out of poverty than any other idea or system in the history of the world. That is a profoundly moral thing to do. And if we walk away from the free enterprise system, the world will follow and people will die. That's the consequence of what we face today. It is not a question of how rich we are. It is a question of whether people will live around the world. So how do we turn this discussion around, because the stakes are so high? How do we do it with ideas and the think tanks? How do we run those ideas to you as the patriots who are on the front line as activists and advocates? Well, there's research on this from psychologists at New York University. And what they say is that Americans have 2 universal moral values that they act upon. What are they? Number 1, fairness matters. I know it makes you sick to think of that word fairness, because you hear President Obama say it all the time, but the truth of the matter is everybody demands fairness. And number 2, We all demand a system that helps the vulnerable. Everybody believes it's right to help the vulnerable. In other words, if you want to be seen as a moral good person, talk about fairness and helping the vulnerable. Here's the problem. We've been handing those ideas to the left for years. They're the fairness guys. They're the helping the poor guys. Who are we? We're the money guys. We say government's too big, regulation's too high, taxes are too high, we got to roll all that stuff back. We're fighting against things, they're fighting for people. Now they're all wrong. They're hurting poor people. We're secretly helping poor people, yet we're doing exactly what it takes to lose the argument. Do you want to win? Start fighting for people instead of fighting against things. Next time somebody says, we got to reform entitlements, you say, that's right, not because they're too expensive, not because we can't afford it, but because when we bankrupt our country, it will be unfair to our kids and it will hurt the very people that we're supposed to help, because austerity always hurts the poor the most. Lead with vulnerable people. Lead with fairness. And you know it's written on your heart. You know that's what you really care about. What drives you crazy about our public schools today? It's not just that they're run by a sclerotic, unionized, terrible system and it costs tons of money. That's true. It's because the bottom 20% of this country are having the civil rights systematically denied. Poor kids don't get a good education, and it's an outrage and a civil rights scandal. It's happening right before us, and that's why it drives you crazy. So talk about that and start to win. And furthermore, be ready to do it for a long time. Our politicians should get up in front of audiences of civil rights activists and poor people and people who never vote for them and say, you know what? I'm going to fight for you whether you vote for me or not. And mean it and do it for 3 or 4 years, and then we'll win, and best of all, it's the right thing to do. Now, we know it's depressing right now, but that's what you're here for. You're the true leaders in this country. You're the activists. You're on the front lines. We in the think tanks, we assist you. We run the idea guns to you. That's not very politically correct. Ideas and leaders are made not for when times are good or the politics are easy or when the country's on the right track. It's for when times are tough. Every one of us knows that this is the beginning of a new era. When we bring the dream back to all Americans, when we revolutionize our movement to talk about the least fortunate members of our society, when we remember our grandparents who came on a boat poor to this country looking for a truly fair system, which meant that it rewarded their hard work for the first time in their lives. Fight for that dream and we'll win. And when we do, it'll be a better country for us and our kids and the people we've never even met. So for your hard work, for your activism, for your fighting, God bless you and thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. John, Allison, and I are among the newest of the presidential leadership group here. In John's case, he's practically new to Washington, D.C., which must be a horrible shock to the system in many ways. But John, why don't you come join us?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Cato because we're a little bit different kind of organization. The vision of Cato is to create a free and prosperous society based on libertarian principles. Individual liberty, free markets, limited government, and peace. We do that through having a bunch of scholars that are able to advance complex arguments based on these principles. And we're in the fight across the whole spectrum, from the long-term implications of deficits to the Federal Reserve printing money, to what are the implications of our drug policy, what are the implications of our immigration policies, in a very objective analysis. We also hit the whole political spectrum. We are neither Republicans or Democrats, we are libertarians, and so we advance our ideas from all perspectives. We also, while we are a mass market organization, on the average day, Cato scholars are quoted in 50 major media outlets. We're really focused on opinion leaders, people that impact other people, political leaders, media, business leaders, but also particularly the academy. We think that the real bad ideas in America have largely come from our universities who have been co-opted by the left, and we're trying to impact the ideas in those universities. We do that with a very fundamental concept about what the rule of government is. And I think it's always important to begin with the right premises. And our fundamental concept is that the only purpose of government, and it's a very important purpose, but it's the only purpose, is to protect individual rights. Is to keep me from taking what you produce through force or fraud, or to keep you from taking what I produce from force or fraud. That's all government was really designed to do. And we see that within the context of the principles that created the United States. We think that the United States is a result of kind of a long tradition and a long study of ideas that matter in human well-being. And that resulted in something called classical liberalism, and we are the modern advocates of classical liberal principles. We think when we talk about the ideas that created the American Revolution, whatever mistakes they may have made technically, the ideas were fundamentally right. And that it's very wrong to treat these ideas as kind of bromides and cliches. That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are very fundamental, unconditional principles. What they imply is that each individual has an unquestionable moral right to their own life. Each individual has a moral right to what they produce. If you produce a lot, you get a lot, including the right to give it away to whoever you want to on whatever terms you want to, for whatever reasons you want to. And I think most importantly, that each of us has the moral right to the pursuit of our personal happiness. We're not guaranteed success in that pursuit, but we have that right. And if you think about a person pursuing their personal happiness, they have to have the right to be free to act consistent with their own beliefs, to act as an independent, free person as having a fundamental right to their whole life. And that idea not only created a tremendously successful country, and it did create a tremendously successful country when people are free, they're more productive, they're more innovative, they're more creative, but it also created a very benevolent country. When people have a right to their own life, they are naturally nicer to other people. In communist and socialist societies, at the end of the day, everybody ends up hating each other because they're all slaves to each other. And we believe that each individual has a moral right to the pursuit of their personal happiness. And that is the American sense of life. And whatever technical differences we may have, I think all of us are really in the business of defending that American sense of life. And that is the foundation of prosperity, and it's also the foundation of personal happiness. And that's what all of these think tanks attempt to do. Thank you very much.
Well, we have a few minutes left before we're all gonged off the stage, but looking at this last election, it may be somewhat trite to say, you know, did we simply lose the argument? Were the candidates not who we wanted? But give it just a quick sense of the frustration level that we each individually have with, was this a failure of ideas, or was it a matter of mechanics and messaging? Ed, you're next to me, so why don't you take an issue with that?
One of the things we conservatives have to learn, whether it's a run-up to an election or whether it's day-to-day communicating through the media, new media, old media, electronic, print, you got to personalize things. This is a picture of my 3 grandkids. Each one of those grandkids, alas, right now has a $220,000 mortgage. Not from John's old bank, mind you, because there's no house attached to these mortgages. Their mortgages are the $220,000 in debt that they're inheriting from my generation, from the unfunded liabilities that we're incurring right now for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. You can't talk to people about billions and trillions. You got to bring it down to real numbers. And this was, to me, one of the big frustrations of last November, and it remains a frustration today. Take human hair. 90,000 human hairs side by side stretch roughly a football field. 90 million, excuse me. 90 billion go for 93 miles. 93 trillion go for that many thousands of miles.
Except for Arthur and me.
You've heard this one, yeah.
It's killing us here.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You can't conceive of these kinds of numbers, but when you talk in simple numbers, make it real for people, and let's get back to that kind of reality in communicating our ideas and why our ideas are better and why we really care about people.
I mean, you really had to bring up hair, didn't you?
Sorry. Personal thing.
It's, you know, there's a lot to be frustrated about. Anytime that a major election is catastrophic for those that you agree with, it's kind of a tragedy, and there's a lot of second guessing. But the truth of the matter is that it's pretty normal in an election to see after a financial crisis people turn toward social democracy. It certainly happened after the Great Depression, and we needed a better game, and we will have a better game. How do we do it? And that has to do with messaging, it has to do with ideas, it has to do with the strength of your activism. What the other side is counting on is that all of you stop being energetic. You stop staying in the fight. But it's really going to depend on the energy of those of us that are trying to build better ideas and better messages, and all of you. And I'm actually pretty confident. I'm pretty optimistic that 2016 is going to look a lot different than 2012. And the reason I am is because I believe in you and what you're doing here.
John?
I'd like to offer a little bit different perspective. I think if you listen to the media, the perspective is, well, the Republican Party is doomed because of the demographics, young people, immigrants, etc. Well, that's an interesting perspective. I think the Democratic Party has got a much bigger problem. Their problem is they've made huge promises that cannot be fulfilled. They have offered something that is a big lie. And so one of our tasks is really helping people through effective communication, through the right kind of leaders, understand that what's being offered won't work. And one thing that's factually true, we will have a moment because it won't work, and the question I think that's very important is for us to have developed policy solutions that take us in the right direction when that moment occurs, because the Democratic Party's policies can't work.
When our institutions worked with politicians decades ago, I think life was a little different in that information is instantaneous now. The ability to market or manipulate social media, et cetera, I think makes it difficult now for a politician to perhaps behave in the right way. The question is, what can we as sort of in the modern version of AEI and CEI and Heritage and Cato do to sort of participate in that new lightning information media frenzy that we have, and how do we have to adapt? Arthur, why don't you...
Our job is getting the message to politicians, but also to business leaders and media leaders and community leaders. In other words, our job is getting the ideas to you so that you can use them. We can't be on the front lines doing all the types of things politically and in activism that you can, and so our job is making sure that's the case. Now, a long time ago, when our institutions were founded, you just do beautiful things and let 1,000 flowers bloom. People will find them. Well, it's a crowded world now. The media it's overwhelming everything. So the truth of the matter is, for us to be successful, we have to be more creative at getting the right messages to the right people. The key to success in the idea business is not having our ideas pulled out of us, but us pushing our ideas to the right people. Do you want policymakers to follow you? Then you need to go to the policymakers proactively. This is how we're building our Hill practice, our media practice, our outreach practice to activist groups, our campus programs. Everything that we're doing at AEI is delivering things to the right people who need them and can use them, because that's the way of the future.
Ed or John?
I think one of the most important things you can do is help people understand that just because something sounds good, it doesn't necessarily actually create good consequences. And, you know, if you look at people that we disagree with on the left, a lot of them do have good intentions, not all of them, but they don't understand that their policies are producing outcomes that they really don't want in the long term. So one of our jobs is to help people understand that good intentions do not always produce good results. And by the way, that can be true of us. You know, do our immigration policies produce the outcomes we want? Those are questions we need to ask objectively, and I think that's how you really change people's opinions, is not necessarily attack their intentions, but say, hey, if you want X, then what you're proposing does not produce what you want.
Lawson, let me follow up on one of the points you made when you talked about the information glut that we all face, and particularly from the new media. The first thing that the four of us will absolutely insist on has got to be the integrity of our research. Our research has to be really upfront, it's got to be solid, and it's got to be unchallengeable. Because you know, if we make a mistake, that the other side is going to find it right away, and as soon as they find it, our guys are not going to be able to count on us. That's number one. And that's important for all of you, because when you're deluged with new media outlets, you've got to know where to go to get the real facts. And we can give you that without bias, without fear or favor, as it were. Our case, we're doing a lot of exciting new things. We've got Heritage Libertad, Spanish language, reaching out to the 40 million Americans whose native language is Spanish. That's what they're speaking at home. We believe, yes, that English should be the language of the United States. But by gosh, if 40 million people are speaking Spanish at home, we want to reach that audience, and we want them to be able to climb up the opportunity ladder too. And we want to be able to work with them in terms of local schools. And that's one of the other big things. When you see something that works, tell the story. Don't put it again in big statistics. Tell the story about the kid in 5th or 6th grade in Raleigh, North Carolina, who we saw when we were down there 10 days ago, who wants to be a scientist. Inner city kid, formerly way behind in terms of his abilities. That's the real story. It isn't statistics about how many thousands are not making it, etc. Find the specific one that really matters.
Well, and if we can emphasize Arthur's point about talk to people, not things. Yeah. Stories matter. Stories have power. If by stories we can help soften people, not to government taking care of them, but to others in a community of a private market doing that, that's ultimately the way we'd like to go. We're running out of time, but Ed, I want to take advantage of having you here. Your role is changing at Heritage in the next few weeks, which, Arthur, that leaves you as the dean, if you will, of the, after only a couple years on the helm. And I guess that means that I got to have DeMint go through some initiation or something, since now I no longer have to be the rookie. But you've got the three of us here. Your role is transitioning at Heritage. You're still keeping involved in the fight, for which we're grateful. But what advice do you have to the three of us so-called young'uns?
Well, this was not a scripted question. Thanks, Lawson. Every institution is different, but every institution, all four of our institutions, I think, have got, number one, maintain that integrity of your research. Number two, communicate more effectively than we ever have before. And we all do this better than we did before. By gosh, I've been over to John's Hayek Auditorium. I've been down so many times to AEI, they think I'm on the staff down there, I think. But, and what we do at Heritage with our own thing, and what you're doing in Fred's great shadow, Lawson, keep our individual identities, define your target audiences, and let's also find more and more ways that we can work together. I remember not too long ago, when we were able to bring together the heads of all think tanks in Washington and stand down at the National Press Club together, and this was left, right, center, and we all said that any president of the United States, no matter what party they're from, ought to have the right to be able to go out and negotiate free trade agreements around the country. Everybody came together. We took the issue off the table by working together. Similarly, there are specific policies we can work together on. We're doing that now in some cases. Let's look for more opportunities, again, to add and multiply, not divide and subtract for the liberty movement.
Amen. Well, Ed, Arthur, and John, thank you very much. And again, thank you to you who are doing the yeoman's work on our behalf. So thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Fox News' brightest and funniest young conservative mind, Steven Crowder.